Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I'm delighted to be back in my hometown and to be speaking on one of my favorite topics, history. I want to thank the Chinatown Storytelling Center for inviting me to speak. I'm delighted to be part of their programming. I'm a great supporter of the foundation and this place. Now, the Storytelling Center has a very thought-provoking question that they've asked in their special exhibit, Our Journey Continues. And the question is, what would you say to your ancestor? So, my dad was born in 1910, so he'd be 113 years old today, and my mother, 110. And what would I say to them? I would say, I wish you had lived to see me grow up. You'd be proud of me. I don't smoke, I don't drink, I never got in trouble with the law. So, but my dad died when I was 5 months old, and my mom died a year later. So I have no memories of my parents. So if Dad had lived to 68 and Mom to age 65, then they would have witnessed my older brother Vern getting married in 1978, and then they would have welcomed the birth of their grandson, Michael, in 1979. This year, 2023, is the centennial of the passage of Canada's exclusion law against Chinese immigrants. And I was asked to talk about how my family and I were affected by the law. So, at the start, while planning this talk, I knew of one event that I believed was caused by the 1923 law that then cut through many following years to affect my life. This event happened in the mid to late 1930s, and it involved my mother's older brother, Foon Wong. And here he is. He had come to Canada in 1913 at the age of 20. Here he is, good-looking young man. In his early days, he worked as a sawmill hand at Port Moody, and then as a dishwasher at the Banff Springs Hotel. Then, when Foon was in his 40s, he took a common law wife here, a Canadian-born woman named Lillian Ho. I think Foon wanted companionship. He already had a wife and offspring in China, but he seemed to want more. So Lillian brought with her a child, but she and Foon did not have more children because she had had a miscarriage that stopped her from having more kids. So this event, this is Foon. So here we have Foon, Lillian, and Lillian's sister, Winifred. So this event, Foon hooking up with Lillian, is tied to exclusion because it's my guess that Foon fell in with Lillian because he could not bring his wife and family from China to Canada. So Foon and Lillian become a couple. And then 20 years later, my parents die, and my brother Vern and I are brought to Vancouver to be raised by Foon and Lillian. Lillian, the woman in the middle, had a huge impact on me. She forced me to learn the Chinese language, something that later helped my research and writing. Now, Lillian was born in Vancouver in 1895. She got as far as a grade 3 education, but was fluent in English. And then she learned to read and write Chinese as an adult. Foon taught her. So when I was a child in the 1960s, Aunt Lillian resolved that my brother and I would learn Chinese. And she had a 4-part plan. At home, she had a rule that only Chinese and no English could be spoken, even though the radio was on all day long due to CKWX, and she read the Vancouver Sun newspaper every day. We had a subscription. So Lillian spoke Cantonese, my uncle spoke Khoisan, so I heard both dialects growing up. And the text that you see on the screen is from a Chinese classic that Lillian had me and my brother memorize. 听得云往雨交风 goes on and on and on. It's a classic poem, but that was Chinese. Part 2 of my aunt's strategy was she refused to have a TV in the house. And that was awful, because every day at Strathcona School at recess, my friends would be nattering about the latest episode of Star Trek, Time Tunnel, or Gunsmoke, and I was left out. Lillian believed that a TV would be a deadly distraction from learning Chinese. She always said to people, oh, I don't worry about the boys not learning in English. I worry about them not learning Chinese. People would applaud. Anyways, third part of her strategy, every Sunday she dragged my brother and I to the Avon Theatre on Hastings Street to sit through a double bill of Hong Kong movies, most of which were Cantonese operas. And this was meant to reinforce learning Chinese. Unfortunately, Cantonese opera is sung in classical Chinese, so I never understood the lyrics. Waste of money. Fourth part. Here's me graduating from Musqueam Chinese School in 1970. I attended classes there for 2 hours every day for 10 years. You'll see that there are actually only 9 students graduating that year. The rest of the people in the photo are teachers, board members, and parents. So that's Aunt Lillian's big influence on me. So today I'm going to present 2 family histories through old photographs. I didn't grow up hearing a lot of family history, and many of the photos you see here today, I didn't see until only recently. A lot of things fell into my hands, and then I left them to the archives, and I left town. I didn't look at everything. So what you see today is what I've pieced together from a lot of different sources. So Aunt Lillian is one of 2 threads that came together in my life. In terms of family, she's on my mother's side of the story. So the first thread I'm going to talk about is my dad, all right? So we'll start with dad's side. So in 1921, my dad comes to Canada as a boy of 11, pays the $500 head tax. By 1924, he's working in a cafe in Bethune, Saskatchewan, which is 40 miles northwest of Regina. My dad returns to China in 1926 and 1937, each time to get married. First time, his wife bears a son, but sadly, the boy dies. Dad's wife then adopts a boy named Park and raises him. But then she too dies. So in 1937, my dad goes again to China, and this time he marries my mom. But no children are born then, so after Dad comes back to Canada, she too adopts a boy named Guy. So my parents have adopted 2 sons before my brother and I come along. So here's my family in 1947. My mom, my brother Park, Guy, and this is Pui, who is Park's wife. Park works in Thailand, while Pui is in the village with my mom and Guy. So here's Mom in Vancouver, just after arriving in 1950, after exclusion is repealed. Now, her move creates a new and different split in my family. Instead of dad being cut off from his wife and kids, now mom and dad are cut off from their eldest child and his family. Exclusion. It's because Park is too old. By 1950, he's 23 and married, and Canada's rules for sponsorship at that time only allowed unmarried children aged 18 and under. Here's mom touring Stanley Park. And this is a key photo for me because it brings together two of the key women in my life, mom and Aunt Lillian on the far right. Mom and Guy then joined Dad in small town Saskatchewan, where he runs a cafe. And of all the photos left behind, this was in the worst shape. Yet it's the only one that shows them at the point of reunion. Mom gives birth to my brother Vern in 1952. My parents seem very happy, and the other woman is likely one of the waitresses at my dad's cafe. 4 years later, I'm born. This is the first image of me with my brother Vern. I have this feeling that my dad was actually really proud of his jukebox. It was a mini difference to cafes. So here's Dad in his cafe. Yes, I've written about the prairies, 2 short stories for adults, then 2 short stories for young readers. And then disaster. My parents died. My father died first, so it was really hard on my mom, who did not speak much English, nor could she read or write Chinese. She was illiterate. So letter writing was difficult. And after they died, 3 things happened. First thing, I'm taken into foster care and almost adopted by this couple, Mr. and Mrs. Clarence Mack of Lillian, Saskatchewan. In fact, I lived with them for several months. Second thing, while I'm in foster care, my Uncle Foon and Aunt Lillian take Vern into their care in Vancouver, and then they decide to raise the 2 brothers together. So I'm brought here too. And I love this photograph because it's the only one I have of my uncle in actual physical contact with me. And for those of you who know Chinese families, physical contact between men and children, minimal. So this photo is just so treasured. And if you look at how he's holding my brother's hand, it's not straightforward. It is very awkward. Here we go. So, I arrived in Vancouver in 1958. Lillian, by this time, is 63 years old, 2 years away from getting her old age pension. But she insists she can raise 2 young boys. As she said, oh, you tend chickens, you tend 1, you tend 10, it's all the same. And then the third thing that happens is this: things fall apart in my father's family. Guy is now an adult, so he goes off to make his own life. I don't see him for the next 20 years. So I lose this older brother. But, of course, there's family left in China. In 1950, when my mom leaves China for Canada, Pui, Park's wife, is left in the village to manage the household and the fields. My mom leaves just in time because this is an era of land reform. When the communist cadres go into villages, debts are canceled, farms get given to the landless, and landlords are killed. We were landlords, our family. Luckily, Pui is strong, resourceful. And here Pui makes it to Hong Kong. And here she is with Park in Hong Kong with their child. But Vern and I lose contact with Park, not only because of my parents' death, because Park also dies in 1960, leaving Pui in Hong Kong with 3 girls to raise. And what Pui does is she remarries. So the family is just cut. It's just cut. So in other words, I lose all contact with this other brother. Okay, jump ahead to 1976. I'm 20. I'm passing through Hong Kong, going into China for a tour. And my uncle in Hong Kong says, "Do you know that your sister-in-law is here?" And I say, "I have a sister-in-law?" And we get together. So here is Pui with her daughter Rita. And from this meeting, after we hook up, 3 things happen. 1, Pui and Rita visit Canada in 1982. And she says to my brother and me, "We have to go to the cemetery to pay respects to their parents." She is stunned to hear that Vern and I have never done so, because Mom and Dad are buried in Regina. So we make a trip of it. We all fly to Regina, and finally, 3 generations of my parents' family are united here at the graveyard. On this trip, I also meet my almost foster parents, the Macs. They're lovely people. And in Vancouver, Pui meets Aunt Lillian and thanks her for raising me and Vern. Now, Pui knows it's very unusual for Vern and me to be raised by maternal side aunts. It's just not done in China. Pui also thanks Aunt Lillian for forcing me to learn Chinese. Otherwise, Pui and I would not be able to communicate. Second thing to happen with Pui is in 1988, after I moved to Toronto, I go to Hong Kong, I'm feeling homesick, and I ask Pui to take me to my father's village. She obliges, so we bring gifts, I meet the villagers, and she takes me to the Hilltop Cemetery, where my ancestors are buried. Our house in the village is still standing, but no one lives there. We don't have any relatives left in China. And the final thing with Pui is that her time with the communist cadres during land reform in the village made her very fearful of the Hong Kong handover to China in 1997. She immigrates to Canada, settles here in Vancouver, and I visit her whenever I come to town. And it's through Pui that I get to know tiny bits about my mother, because they had lived together in the village. So this is the amazing story of family. In Chinese Canadian history, he shares that experience with thousands of other men. He's not different. And this makes him one of those bachelor men. But for me, I never thought of him as a bachelor because, one, well, he had a name, Gordon. He was my father. He had kids. So how could he be a bachelor? It didn't make sense. And then after I met Pui, my sister-in-law, we both lamented Canada's immigration law. We couldn't help but imagine an alternate past that might have happened. What if my mother had come to Canada earlier? Then I might have grown up with more siblings, maybe a sister, which I've always wanted. You know, this would be great. Or what if my dad could have brought Park to Canada earlier along with Pui, and then Park may not have died in Hong Kong, and I'd have these cousins who growing up as Canadians. It just blew our mind trying to imagine and seeing the possibilities that were so close, so close in the family, and yet cut by the law. So my dad's story is a kind of standard Chinese Canadian narrative. It starts with the first arrival of a male. He works here. He tries to make a family, but it's thwarted by immigration laws and by Mother Nature. And then things get better when the exclusion law is repealed, yet Mother Nature can still claim lives and cause havoc. But there is, as you have seen, great resilience in family, and so in a way, there's a happy ending to my father's story. I get reconciled to my lost brother's family. And very often in Chinese Canadian history, I think we look for histories like this or stories like this because we want to be reassured by history and see that all the early struggles of the ancestors bore fruit, that it was all worth it, what they went through, just so that my generation could tell the story in a happy kind of gathering. So that's a lesson, I think. One lesson for me from exclusion is our need for these stories that come full circle, just to give something to the ancestors that said, you did the right thing and we thank you, with this coming full circle. So this is the first time that I've put my family history on show, so please bear with me. The quality of photos is amazing, this projector. I was so surprised when I was doing it at home. I thought, oh God, God is not going to like these photos. And I should tell you this, I did this slideshow not only because Storytelling Center invited me, but because my brother's daughter, Jennifer, gave birth in August to her third child. So Vern and his wife now have 5 grandchildren, and this show is for them. So on to the story about my mother's side of the family, which connects to Aunt Lillian. I already told you that Aunt Lillian forced me to learn Chinese. And you would think that she was a cultural conservative, but she wasn't, not from the bits of her life that I've pieced together. So here's her story, and I promise to relate it back to the exclusion theme at the end. So this is the earliest picture I have of Lillian's father. This is Ho Chong, here in 1906 on the executive of Vancouver's Chinese Empire Reform Association. Ho Chong came to Vancouver around 1892, and the workers in his shop sold clothing for Spencer's department store. And Ho Chong leaned towards the West. In 1906, he was naturalized as a British subject. So he wanted that. In 1890, Ho Chong's brother brings him a wife from China, a girl named Cha Yaodong, who is 17 years old. In all the pictures I've seen of her, she always wears Western clothing, never Chinese. And over the years, Cha Yaodong, she bears Ho Chong 9 children, of which 5 survived to adulthood. Lillian here is the oldest daughter. She's smartly dressed here, but don't be fooled. Ho Chong went to China in 1908 on a business trip and died there, leaving Yaodong to raise 5 children by herself in Vancouver. Times were tough. At one point, she sent Lillian to live at the Chinese Girls Rescue Home, which was set up by the Methodist Church in Victoria. Lillian hated it, and she came back and went to work as a servant in a white household. So here are the 3 surviving sisters, Lillian, Winifred, and Nellie. Their mother looks far and wide for a husband for Lillian and matches her with Henry H., a well-educated Chinese American who, I've been told, worked for the US immigration authorities as a translator. So Lillian moves to Seattle and bears a girl, Emily. I think this is Emily with Lillian's older brother, Sam, who's come to visit. But Emily dies. And then Lillian sues Henry for divorce. Lillian then moves back to Vancouver and finds a job downtown in a hat maker's store. Here she is with her white co-workers. Lillian, of course, had grown up working with needle and thread because in her father's shop, they had done all the hand stitching, along with her mother and her sisters. And she stays close to her sisters, who have also gotten married. Her sisters moved to the US because Lillian's older brother, Sam, did an engineering degree at the University of Milwaukee and befriended many Chinese Americans. In the 1920s, Lillian meets this handsome man, Yu, and they become a couple. Here they are at Stanley Park at the newly unveiled Harding Memorial. Lillian gets pregnant, but this is when she has a miscarriage. And then her relationship with Yu falls apart, and she goes home to live with her mother. I lived with Aunt Lillian until she died in 1985, and all her life, she refused to talk about these first two husbands of her. She would not say a word. Then, Lillian becomes a mother. In the 1930s, she meets Hilda Hellaby, an outspoken missionary social worker at the Anglican Good Shepherd Mission, who works closely with the women and children of Chinatown. So Hellaby helps Lillian adopt two children, a girl named witulh, and then a boy named Eugene, who is of mixed parentage, Chinese and white. So Lillian becomes a single mother. But I believe Hellaby helped Lillian get the BC Mother's Pension, a form of income support that started in 1920. Witulh, the girl, dies as a child, but Eugene survives to adulthood. And Lillian and Eugene live in Strathcona and have white friends as well as Chinese ones. So it's while Lillian is raising Eugene that she meets and falls in with my uncle Foon here. And they get together for the next 30 years. Lillian learns to knit at Woodward's department store, and this is one of her sweaters, and you can see that she's emblazoned an F for Foon. And all her life she was knitting sweaters for Very High as well. But Foon has family in China. In fact, when Lil meets Foon, he already has adult children who have children, which makes Foon a grandfather already. So take a good look at the adults in this photo, because you'll see them again in the next slide. Here is my mother's side of the family. Maternal grandmother, Foon's wife, and her two sons, this one and this one. Older son's wife. And then this is Foon's younger brother. And so this photograph has 4 kids of the younger generation. A few years later, we meet the same bunch, except now we meet my grandmother again, Foon's wife, except now everybody's having babies. And there are 9 kids of the younger generation. So in total, Foon has a total of 12 grandchildren. His son there has 5 daughters and 1 son. His daughter has 4 sons and 2 daughters. He's a grandfather of all these children, but he's not there. So, Foon also has more family in Canada. His brothers-in-law, that is, the brothers of his wife, are potato farmers in Richmond. And this is where we are. And when I was growing up in the 1960s, the farm uncles were always invited to our home for Christmas and the New Year dinners. During World War II, Foon joins the Air Raid Patrol that monitors Vancouver Chinatown. Here are all the air raid wardens and their counterparts in civilian defense gathered at the Chinese Benevolent Association. During this time, Foon joins the board of several organizations formed by the Wong clan and sits on the executive of the Chinese Benevolent Association. The CBA is an active lobbyist for Chinatown's issue. Here is Foon in the corner with the then Member of Parliament the Vancouver Centre, Jack Nicholson. Here's Musqueam. And Nicholson was a federal cabinet minister for citizenship and immigration in 1964 and 65. So they knew how to lobby. Phu's rise gives Lillian a bit of entry into the social scene that revolved around the traditional organizations of Chinatown. So here we have my aunt Lillian. These are the teachers from long-term school. But it was a very limited entry because those groups were all male-dominated. This photo is from the Chinese school, a project completely underwritten by the Wong clan. And even though education was dominated by women, like when I went there, most of the teachers were women. But this board is all men. Here's Uncle Phu. This is how I remember him. A very easygoing fellow, even-tempered, good-natured, kind. I rarely saw him get angry or impatient. And I think of him today as a figure between two worlds. On one hand, there was Chinatown, which emerged out of an overseas settlement that was Chinese and Canadian in its makeup. And here's what I mean. Here's an image of Chinese-Canadian women at a social event at the Wong School. None of these women are wearing traditional Chinese garb. And here's an image of the women of Phu's family in Hong Kong. I don't know what the occasion is or why all these women, which includes my grandmother and Phu's wife, are all wearing black. I don't know. But the contrast for me is there. Different look, different outlook, very different experiences. So, back to the exclusion story. After the ban on immigration is lifted, Phu's younger son, Richard, qualifies to be sponsored to Canada. And here he is, young man, good-looking, shortly after his arrival. There's my uncle. Notice that Lillian is not in this picture. When Richard gets married around 1960, it is a big deal in Chinatown because of my uncle's community work. And here are Lillian and Phu dressed to the nines. My uncle in a tux. Whoa! This is one of the last pictures taken of my Uncle Phu. It's 1968. He's with Lillian, me, and Vern, and 3 of the 4 grandsons who were born here to Richard and his wife. So while this is family, it's not Phu's whole family. Because here's Phu's wife and his daughter and the other grandchildren in Hong Kong. These are my first cousins that I don't know. And just part of the first cousins that I don't know. So that's a quick peek into the lives of my Uncle Phu and Aunt Lillian. To end this talk, let me say a few things about how exclusion affected them. My Uncle Phu was, quote, a bachelor man like my father for many years, while separated from his family in China. But he made a choice to take on a local wife, and that was very much to my benefit. And here's the key. Because if Phu did not have a wife here in Canada, it's doubtful that the social work authorities would have allowed him to become legal guardians to my brother Vern and I after my parents died. So the possibility is I may not have grown up in Vancouver if not for that particular click. In Chinese Canadian history, we rightly view the repeal of exclusion against Chinese immigration as the removal of a racist, unfair law. The repeal was to be celebrated because the Chinese in Canada could finally start to bring over their families. But the repeal affects Phu and Lillian in different ways. Foon is able to bring his son to Canada, and later his son decides to bring his mother to Canada. This, of course, affects Lillian. What if, and this is a big what if supposition, what if Lillian hooked up with Foon back in the 1930s, thinking that he would never be able to bring over his family from China? Could she have looked around at Canada's long-standing hatred of Chinese people and said, they'll never change. They will never change this law because they hate us so much. And so, she thinks it's safe to go with Foon. And then, of course, in 1947, her world gets torn up. She survives, of course, but she has to be happy for Foon because he can bring his son over. She has to be happy that the Chinese community can grow because Foon, of course, has business interests in Chinatown. And she has to be happy because race relations are getting better. But now she has to make room for Foon's China family. So Lillian may have felt pain. And this, I think, can remind us of how Chinese Canadian history contained enormous amounts of personal pain. People were scarred. Our ancestors were scarred. They did not get what they wanted. They had to settle for this. And this year, 2023, marking the start of exclusion, seems to take us back to the heart of that pain. Thank you. Back to you.
So my job actually is to ask you some questions, and probably the floor can be open again. Just say that I think with Saltwater City, I was present at the creation in a way. Although before that we had published an anthology, Many Mouthed Birds. So in publishing the Saltwater City, and I saw the show, and I thought, there's an important book here. And at Douglas McIntyre, we really tried to publish books that gave voice to marginal communities, amongst them, at that time, the Chinese Canadian community here, and First Nations. I realized this stuff had not been done in Canada for 50 years. So I'm very proud of that. But we're not here to talk about me, we're here to talk about you. And so, Paul, my question would be, given you're an archivist, you've 2 history degrees, what led you after Saltwater City, which was a significant bit of research, what led you into the writing of the children's books, which has been preoccupied, I think, your major preoccupation since award-winning Canada Council, Governor Generals, xʷməthkվəy, I think, in various. So what led you to turn your attention from history to children's books?
So I couldn't see a future for myself in academic history. I didn't want to do a PhD. I didn't see myself doing more research. But I wanted the stories about Chinese Canadian history to be spread out. And I wanted to teach young people about the history. It was a very purposeful kind of writing. I wanted kids to pick up bits and pieces of the history from the stories that I would write. And that's what led me to stop writing nonfiction and to focus mostly on making up stories because it was a lot of fun. And I wanted to try and be creative. I needed to push my own envelope about being creative and look for new stories to tell young people. That's really all it was.
The power of stories. All countries understand that. And the one thing I would say is those books, and Tradewinds published a number of them, and we published, I think, the early ones, they have given us Christmas presents to distribute for a great many years. All right, so in this longish career of years, what are you proudest of?
What am I proudest of? At this point in my life, I guess it's the fact that I was able to write a novel for adults. I didn't want to kind of go down in history known as mostly as a writer for young readers. I mean, not to put that down, but I needed to kind of prove to myself that I could do it. And this is Chinese Canadian thing. Always gotta prove that something. And so, being an orphan, there was added pressure to prove whatever. So, my first adult novel, just made me feel complete. That I can do this. I can write whatever I choose, and I can write. That was very comfortable.
You're in good company there. And I was going to say, I think you've answered it. Really, what have been the mainstream, the wellsprings of your imagination? Family stories, mythology.
The source of my imagination is research. I love doing research. When I write novels, I do 50 times the amount of research that actually gets into the book. I just love going down those rabbit holes. What did people wear? Could Lillian have a driver's license? Could she have a license? 2 days later, there were no licenses issued. So I love doing research, and that's where the stories come from. Research.
Okay. And again, I go back to stories. And in fact, when I first encountered this place, thanks to Lillian and you, I realized that we came here without knowing any of this, and the stories were so powerful and had been collected and existed. And of course, it seemed to me there are many books in that, and we're talking about that. They're here, given everything that's happened down here over the last 20, 30 years. This is a very brave experiment, and I basically said, look, I think what you're doing is extraordinary, and I want to help. And that's why I'm here. And my final question then is, what's next for you?
What's next for me? I have written a second novel for adults. It's set in the Gold Rush period. And it's about a Chinese gold mine. One of many Chinese gold miners who come here. But in 1864, he goes home from BC, or from British Columbia, but he brings with him a First Nations woman and a child of mixed heritage. My protagonist knows that this woman is not going to be welcome in the village. China is not welcoming to strangers. So why would he do this? And I'm really exploring the relationship between First Nations and early Chinese. I'm very curious about what that interplay was. And I think it's because it's my part for truth and reconciliation. I've done enough stuff on how great the Chinese were, how hard we were, and how much we suffered. But there's a huge backdrop to BC's history that we have barely touched with our First Nations. And I think it's our it's part of my responsibility to start looking at it and to kind of raise those issues. So that's how I see my future writing going.
Of course, the Haida would say you're all related anyway, given what happened along the coast.
Diane's question is, will there be an update to the Saltwater City book? So we did, Scott was good.
We have talked about that.
Right. We did one update back in 2008-ish.
20 years ago.
Yeah, 20 years ago. We did one update, and of course things have changed dramatically. I think there is interest in updating because so much has happened. So it's a big question mark as to who should do it. I don't live here anymore, but there's huge interest in how Chinatown and the Chinese Canadian community will develop going forth from here and now, because it's a whole new ballgame. Okay? And what the Chinatown Foundation doing is really revolutionary. And how do we pull that all together? How does it become, one kind of story? Is it about an ongoing struggle to survive? What happened? What happened between 1986, when we were so optimistic about Chinatown, and what happened recently when the racism was so stark? What happened? And so there are really interesting questions to be asked. We don't know the answers yet.